April 19th, 1944. USS Essex, somewhere in the Philippine Sea. Aviation Machinist's mate second class, John Henderson, wiped the grease from his hands as he stepped back from the engine cowling of an F6F Hellcat. The 18 cylinders of the Pratt and Whitney R 2800 Double Wasp gleamed dully in the tropical sun. But something about this particular engine was different. Something the Japanese would not understand until it was far too late. Henderson glanced at the small metal tank mounted near the firewall. Inside sat a mixture of water and methanol, precisely measured, precisely calculated. The anti-detonant injection system. Water injection. To the pilots gathering for the morning briefing, it was just another modification, another technical improvement in a war filled with constant upgrades. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To the Japanese Zero pilots who would face these Hellcats in the skies over the Marianas, it would represent the final widening of a performance gap they could never close. The morning light caught the fresh paint on the Hellcat's fuselage. Bureau number 58310, one of the first production F6F-5s to reach the fleet. The -3 model had been good. Pilots respected it. But this new variant carried something the earlier Hellcats lacked. With the push of a button, with the engagement of a single system, an American pilot could command 250 additional horsepower for crucial moments in combat. Enough power to climb faster than any Japanese fighter, enough power to escape any situation, enough power to dictate the terms of every engagement. The story of how this advantage came to exist did not begin with mechanics on carrier decks. It began in the engineering laboratories at Pratt and Whitney, where men in white coats understood that the future of aerial combat would be decided not by maneuverability alone, but by raw power applied at critical moments. They understood that the pilot who could climb highest, who could accelerate fastest, who could maintain speed in a vertical climb, would be the pilot who survived. And they understood that conventional engine design had reached a temporary ceiling. What they needed was a way to push beyond the thermal limits, beyond the detonation margins, beyond what piston engines were supposed to achieve. Water injection was not a new concept in 1944. The principle had been understood for years. Inject a fine mist of water and alcohol into the intake charge, and the evaporation of that liquid absorbed tremendous amounts of heat. Cooler intake temperatures meant denser air. Denser air meant more oxygen per combustion cycle. More oxygen meant more power. But water injection also did something else, something crucial for high-performance engines operating at extreme boost pressures. It suppressed detonation. Detonation was the enemy of every high-performance piston engine. When the air-fuel mixture compressed too rapidly, when temperatures climbed too high before the spark plug fired, the mixture spontaneously ignited. The result was not a controlled burn, but an uncontrolled explosion. Shock waves hammered pistons, cylinder heads cracked, engines destroyed themselves within seconds. The higher the manifold pressure, the greater the risk. And combat demanded high manifold pressure. Combat demanded every ounce of power an engine could produce. Pratt and Whitney engineers had been developing the R 2800 engine since 1936. By 1940, the Double Wasp was already proving itself in early tests. When the prototype Corsair achieved 405 miles per hour in level flight that year, it established a new world record and demonstrated the R 2800's potential. But the war demanded more, always more. The early F6F-3s used the R 2800-10 engine, producing 2,000 horsepower at military power settings. Respectable, effective, but not exceptional. The -10W engine changed everything. The W suffix designated water injection capability. The anti-detonant injection system, ADI in Navy terminology, used a 50-50 mixture of water and methanol. Water for cooling, methanol to prevent freezing at altitude and to add a slight combustible component. The mixture was stored in a pressurized tank and injected directly into the carburetor when the pilot activated the system. The effect was immediate. Manifold pressure could climb safely to levels that would have destroyed an engine without ADI. 2,000 horsepower became 2,200 horsepower, and for brief periods, under emergency combat conditions, the engine could produce even more. But raw numbers told only part of the story. What mattered in combat was what those numbers meant in three-dimensional space, in the geometry of aerial warfare, in the split-second calculations that determined who lived and who died. A Hellcat-3 could climb at approximately 2,600 feet per minute. Excellent performance by any standard. The Zero could climb slightly faster below 14,000 feet, giving Japanese pilots a brief tactical advantage in that specific regime. But a Hellcat-5 running water injection could sustain climb rates that exceeded anything the Zero could achieve. More importantly, it could maintain high speed while climbing. The Zero had to sacrifice speed for altitude. The Hellcat with water injection could have both. Commander David McCampbell knew what this meant. By October 1944, he was already the Navy's leading ace, with 21 confirmed victories. His personal Hellcat, Bureau number 58,469, was an F6F-5, equipped with the full water injection system. He called it Mincy 3, after Mincy Lake near his Pennsylvania home. The aircraft was more than a machine to McCampbell. It was a weapons system designed around a specific combat philosophy. Never accept a fair fight. Always maintain the advantage. Use superior performance to dictate engagement terms. On the morning of October 24, 1944, McCampbell would need every advantage his Hellcat could provide. The Essex was part of Task Force 38, steaming off the Philippines during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japanese naval aviation, desperate to stop the American advance, was throwing everything remaining into massive counterstrikes. Hundreds of aircraft, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, were converging on the American carriers. McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, launched as part of the Combat Air Patrol. Their mission was straightforward: find enemy aircraft, destroy them before they reached the fleet. But what they encountered in the skies over the Philippine Sea that morning exceeded anything in their training. A formation of more than 60 Japanese aircraft, heading directly toward Task Force 38, 2 Hellcats against 60 enemy planes. The tactical situation required perfect calculation. McCampbell could not simply dive into the formation and hope to survive. Even with his Hellcat's superior firepower and protection, the numbers were overwhelming. What he needed was patience, altitude advantage, and the ability to strike repeatedly without being caught. Water injection gave him that ability. He climbed above the Japanese formation, his R-2800-10W engine pulling strongly, the ADI system feeding its mixture of water and methanol into the hungry cylinders. At 20,000 feet, he had the altitude. Now he needed to use it. The engagement lasted 95 minutes. 95 minutes of calculated aggression, of boom and zoom attacks, of using every advantage the Hellcat provided. McCampbell would dive on a straggler, fire a precise burst from his .650 caliber Brownings, then pull up sharply, his engine roaring at full power with water injection engaged. The Japanese fighters could not catch him. They tried. Zero pilots would pull into vertical climbs, attempting to follow the climbing Hellcat. But their engines, running on increasingly poor quality fuel, could not sustain the power. They would stall, fall away, become targets themselves. Again and again, McCampbell repeated the pattern: dive, fire, climb. The water injection system allowed him to maintain combat power far longer than Japanese pilots expected. Where they anticipated an American fighter to be vulnerable during the climb phase, gasping for power, instead they found a Hellcat accelerating away, climbing at rates that seemed impossible. By the time McCampbell and Rushing broke off the engagement, fuel critically low and ammunition exhausted, they had destroyed 16 Japanese aircraft between them. McCampbell personally claimed 9. The after-action report from that mission would eventually help earn McCampbell the Medal of Honor. But the technical reality underlying his success was something most people never saw. The small tank of water methanol mixture, the injection nozzles in the carburetor, the engineering that allowed an already excellent fighter to become exceptional at critical moments. These were the details that won wars. not because they made good stories, but because they gave men like McCampbell the tools to survive and to destroy the enemy with ruthless efficiency. Back on the Essex, Henderson and his fellow mechanics would service McCampbell's Hellcat, refilling the water methanol tank, checking the injection system for proper operation. To them, it was routine maintenance. But in the larger context of the Pacific War, it was something more. It was the manifestation of American industrial and engineering superiority, expressed in gallons of liquid, in pressure gauges and injection nozzles, in the accumulated knowledge of engineers who understood that war was won by the side that could innovate faster, produce better equipment, and deploy it before the enemy understood what was happening. The Japanese knew the Americans had introduced an improved Hellcat variant. Intelligence reports mentioned the F6F-5, noting improved engine cowling and minor aerodynamic refinements. But the reports missed the critical detail. They failed to understand that the real improvement was not what could be seen from outside, but what happened inside the engine when a pilot needed maximum power. The water injection system was not classified. It was not secret. But its implications were not fully grasped by Japanese naval aviation until after the war, when captured American aircraft could be examined in detail and their performance characteristics finally understood. By then, of course, it was far too late. The Great Marianas turkey shoot in June 1944 had already demonstrated what happened when Japanese aviation faced the full weight of American carrier air power. 350 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day, most shot down by Hellcats. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October had confirmed that Japanese naval aviation was finished as an effective fighting force. And in the months that followed, as kamikazes became Japan's desperate final tactic, Hellcats, equipped with water injection, would prove essential in defending the fleet, intercepting suicide aircraft before they could strike. The development of the R2800-10W engine and its integration into the F6F-5 represented a specific kind of technological advantage. Not revolutionary, not flashy, but profoundly effective. The water injection system added approximately 200 pounds to the aircraft's empty weight. The water methanol tank held enough mixture for about 15 minutes of continuous operation, though combat use was typically measured in seconds or minutes during critical phases of engagement. The system required additional maintenance. Corrosion was a constant concern. Mechanics had to ensure proper mixture ratios, check injection nozzles for clogs, verify that the pressurization system was functioning correctly. But the operational benefits overwhelmed these minor complications. Hellcat squadrons that received the -5 variant in mid to late 1944 reported immediate improvements in combat effectiveness. Pilots noted that they could engage enemy aircraft at higher altitudes with greater confidence. They could escape unfavorable situations more reliably. They could maintain formation integrity during high-power climbs without stragglers falling behind. These tactical advantages accumulated into strategic superiority. The contrast with Japanese aviation grew starker with each passing month. While American industry was producing thousands of Hellcats with water injection systems, each one representing the cutting edge of naval fighter design, Japanese industry was struggling to maintain production of any aircraft at all. Allied bombing of Japanese synthetic fuel plants had created chronic fuel shortages. The fuel that was available was increasingly poor quality, low octane, barely adequate to keep engines running at normal power settings. The idea of adding a sophisticated power boost system like water injection was beyond Japanese industrial capacity in 1944. Japanese fighter pilots flew knowing that their aircraft represented the best their nation could produce under wartime conditions. The A6M0 had been a remarkable design in 1941, lightweight, maneuverable, with excellent range. But by 1944, it was obsolete. No amount of pilot skill could overcome the fundamental performance deficiencies. Against a Hellcat-3, a skilled Zero pilot might find brief tactical opportunities. Against a Hellcat-5 with water injection, flown by an American pilot with hundreds of training hours, those opportunities vanished. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was significant. Survivors of encounters with late-war American fighters consistently reported that the performance gap seemed impossible. American fighters could climb away at will. They could dive away at speeds Japanese fighters could not match. They could maintain high-speed combat maneuvers without losing energy. And when Japanese pilots tried to exploit the Zero's superior low-speed maneuverability, American pilots simply refused to dogfight. They would extend away, climb, and re-engage on their own terms. Water injection made this tactic nearly foolproof. In the ready rooms of American carriers, pilots received briefings on proper use of the water injection system. Engage it during combat when maximum power was needed. Do not leave it running continuously. The water-methanol mixture was limited. Use it wisely. Most pilots understood intuitively. The system was an emergency reserve, a combat boost, not a continuous power setting. In practice, most combat engagements used water injection for a total of perhaps 2 to 5 minutes per sortie, enough for critical climbs, high-speed maneuvers, and emergency escapes. The rest of the time, the Hellcat operated on normal military power, still formidable, still superior to anything Japan could field. But those few minutes of boosted power made all the difference. They represented the margin between a close fight and a decisive victory. They meant the difference between a pilot returning to his carrier and a pilot going into the sea. In an environment where every advantage mattered, where the smallest performance edge could determine survival, water injection was not just useful, it was essential. The engineering philosophy behind the water injection system reflected broader American advantages in World War II. While German and Japanese engineers often pursued elegant, complex solutions to technical problems, American engineers favored practical, manufacturable designs that could be produced at scale and maintained under field conditions. Water injection was not particularly elegant. It was a brute force method of increasing power. Spray liquid into the intake, cool the charge, suppress detonation, make more power. Simple, effective. And, crucially, something that could be installed on thousands of engines without requiring exotic materials or highly specialized manufacturing techniques. Pratt and Whitney produced more than 125,000 R2800 engines during and after World War II. Not all carried water injection, but a significant percentage of late-war production incorporated the -10W variant or similar water-injected versions. This production scale meant that American naval aviation could field entire carrier air groups equipped with water-injected Hellcats by late 1944. Japanese naval aviation, by contrast, could barely maintain operational squadrons with any aircraft at all. The story of the F6F-5 and its water injection system is ultimately a story about how wars are won. Not through single decisive battles, though those matter, not through individual heroism, though that matters too, but through the accumulated advantages of industrial capacity, engineering competence, and organizational effectiveness. The water injection system was one small piece of a much larger machine, but it was a piece that worked. It gave American pilots a tangible, measurable advantage every time they flew. And in a war measured in thousands of sorties, in hundreds of thousands of combat hours, those small advantages accumulated into overwhelming superiority. By the time production of the F6F-5 shifted to the final variant, the -6 with an even more powerful R2800-18W engine, the war was nearly over. The -6 never entered mass production. It was not needed. The -5 had already done its job. It had helped secure air superiority over the Pacific. It had protected the carriers that launched the strikes against Japanese positions. It had ensured that American bombers could reach their targets, that American amphibious assaults could proceed under friendly air cover, that Japanese aviation could never again seriously threaten American naval operations. The technical specifications of the water injection system merit closer examination. The R2800-10W engine used a Stromberg injection carburetor mounted at the top of the auxiliary section. The anti-detonant injection nozzles fed into the carburetor throat, where the water-methanol mixture atomized and mixed with the incoming air-fuel charge. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The system was activated by a switch in the cockpit, usually positioned on the throttle quadrant for easy access during high-stress combat situations. When activated, a pump pressurized the water-methanol mixture and forced it through calibrated nozzles. The mixture ratio was critical. Too much water, and combustion efficiency suffered. Too little, and detonation suppression was inadequate. The 50-50 water-methanol mixture represented an optimal compromise. The water provided maximum cooling through evaporation. The methanol prevented freezing at altitude, where temperatures could drop to -40 degrees or colder. The methanol also contributed a small amount of combustible energy, though this was secondary to its antifreeze function. Engine power output with water injection engaged rose from 2,000 horsepower to 2,200 horsepower at military power settings. Under emergency power conditions, the engine could briefly produce even more, but thermal limits and mechanical stress meant that sustained operation at maximum boost was not advisable. Pilots were trained to use water injection in bursts, engage it for a combat climb, disengage once altitude advantage was secured, engage it again for a high-speed escape maneuver, disengage during cruise. This intermittent usage pattern meant that the limited water-methanol supply typically lasted through multiple combat cycles within a single sortie. The introduction of water-injected Hellcats coincided with a broader transformation in American carrier aviation. By mid-1944, the U.S. Navy was operating Essex-class carriers in large numbers. These fast carriers, displacing 45,000 tons fully loaded, could carry air groups of 90 aircraft or more. When Task Force 58 assembled for the Marianas operation in June 1944, it included 15 carriers with more than 900 aircraft. Of the fighters, the overwhelming majority were Hellcats, and an increasing number were the new -5 variant with water injection. This concentration of advanced naval air power was unprecedented in history. No navy had ever assembled such a force, and the Hellcats that flew from those carriers represented the pinnacle of American fighter design for that moment in the war, not the fastest fighters in absolute terms. The Corsair was faster, the P-51 Mustang was faster, but for carrier operations, for the specific demands of naval aviation in the Pacific, the Hellcat was optimal. Easy to land on a pitching carrier deck, forgiving of pilot errors, rugged enough to survive combat damage that would destroy less robust aircraft, and, with water injection, powerful enough to dominate any adversary. Japanese naval aviation entered the Marianas campaign with approximately 450 carrier-based aircraft. On paper, this represented a formidable force. In practice, it was inadequate. Most of the pilots were hastily trained replacements. The veterans who had fought since Pearl Harbor were largely dead, shot down over the Solomons, over Rabaul, over countless atolls and islands. The new pilots had perhaps 100 hours of flight time, barely enough to master basic flight operations, let alone combat tactics. Against American pilots with 300 to 500 hours of training, flying superior aircraft, they stood almost no chance. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19, 1944, demonstrated this disparity in brutal clarity. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft attacked Task Force 58. Wave after wave was intercepted by Hellcats. The radar-directed combat air patrols were positioned perfectly. They had altitude advantage. They had numerical advantage. And they had Hellcats with performance capabilities the Japanese could not match. In a single day, American fighters shot down approximately 350 Japanese aircraft. American losses were minimal. 30 planes to all causes, including operational accidents and anti-aircraft fire. For the pilots flying those Hellcats, the combat was intense but one-sided. Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu, flying from the USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in a single engagement lasting less than 10 minutes. His Hellcat's water injection system allowed him to maintain high speed while climbing back to altitude between attacks. He could position himself for optimal firing solutions, take his shot, then climb away before Japanese escort fighters could respond. This was not dogfighting. This was systematic destruction, enabled by superior equipment and training. The accounts from Japanese pilots who survived the turkey shoot told a different story. They described confusion, fear, and the horrifying realization that they were completely outmatched. American fighters seemed to be everywhere. They were faster. They could climb impossibly quickly. And when Japanese fighters tried to engage, the Americans simply accelerated away, climbing at full power, leaving the Zeros struggling to follow. Many Japanese pilots never fired their guns. They were shot down before they could even get into position. Those who did fire found their targets impossibly elusive. After the Marianas, Japanese naval aviation never recovered. The carrier force had been gutted. 3 fleet carriers sunk, including the veterans Shokaku and Taiho. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed, hundreds of pilots killed or missing. The training pipeline could not replace these losses. Japan was running out of fuel, out of experienced instructors, out of time. The remaining pilots flew with increasing desperation, knowing that each mission might be their last, not because they might be shot down, but because there might not be fuel for another mission. American carrier aviation, by contrast, grew stronger. More Essex-class carriers joined the fleet. More Hellcats rolled off Grumman's production lines in Bethpage, New York. More pilots graduated from training squadrons, eager to join the fight. The industrial and organizational machine that was the United States in 1944 was operating at full capacity. Everything was optimized for production, for training, for maintaining the offensive momentum that would carry American forces to Japan's home islands. The water injection system was just one component of this larger machine, but it was a component that mattered. Every time a Hellcat pilot pushed the throttle forward and engaged water injection, he was benefiting from the work of engineers at Pratt and Whitney, from the industrial workers who manufactured the engines, from the supply chains that delivered water and methanol to carrier decks, from the mechanics who maintained the systems under difficult conditions. All of this was invisible to the pilots. They simply knew that when they needed maximum power, their aircraft delivered. In the months following the Marianas, Hellcats with water injection participated in every major carrier operation. The strikes on the Philippines in September and October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the campaigns against Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the final strikes against the Japanese home islands in the summer of 1945. In every engagement, the performance, advantage provided by water injection gave American pilots greater tactical flexibility. They could be more aggressive. They could take risks that would have been suicidal in earlier aircraft. They could rescue wingmen from dangerous situations because they had the power reserve to climb quickly, to accelerate out of trouble. The kamikaze threat that emerged in late 1944 made water injection even more valuable. Kamikaze aircraft, often obsolete trainers or worn-out fighters loaded with explosives, had one mission: crash into American ships. They did not need to return. They did not need to dogfight. They only needed to get through the defensive screen and hit a target. Hellcats became the primary weapon against kamikazes. Combat air patrols orbited the carriers in layers, from low altitude to high altitude. When radar detected incoming raids, the Hellcats would vector to intercept. Against kamikazes, speed was everything. The faster a Hellcat could reach the interception point, the better the chance of destroying the kamikaze before it entered its final dive. Water injection gave Hellcat pilots that speed. They could go to full power, engage the ADI system, and sprint to the intercept point. Many kamikaze pilots never saw the Hellcats that shot them down. They were focused on finding their target, on making their final approach, when 650 caliber machine guns tore their aircraft apart. The statistics from the kamikaze period are telling. Despite hundreds of kamikaze attacks launched against American carriers and supporting ships, relatively few succeeded in causing significant damage. This was largely due to the effectiveness of the defensive screen. Hellcats shot down thousands of kamikazes. Not all, of course. Some got through. But the percentage that succeeded was far lower than Japanese planners had hoped. and water injection was part of that defensive success. It gave the defending fighters the performance margin they needed to intercept, rapidly, to maintain multiple combat air patrol stations, to cover gaps in the defensive screen. By the spring of 1945, as American forces prepared for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, the F6F-5 Hellcat had become the standard carrier fighter. The -3 was still in service, still effective, but increasingly being rotated to secondary duties or reserve squadrons. The -5 was the frontline fighter, the aircraft that pilots wanted to fly, the aircraft that commanders trusted to get the job done. And the water injection system was no longer a novelty. It was standard equipment, expected, relied upon. The planned invasion of Japan never happened. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before Operation Downfall could be launched. But the Hellcats were ready. Task Force 38, with hundreds of Hellcats aboard multiple carriers, was prepared to support the invasion with the largest carrier airstrikes in history. The pilots were trained. The aircraft were maintained. The water methanol tanks were full. Everything was in place for the final campaign. And then, suddenly, it was over. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. For the Hellcat pilots who had flown combat missions for 2 years, the news brought relief mixed with disbelief. The war they had trained for, fought in, lost friends to, was finished. Their Hellcats, including the precious -5 variants with water injection, would not be needed for further combat. Some pilots flew their aircraft in victory flyovers, others participated in occupation operations. But the days of combat air patrols and bomber escorts and kamikaze interceptions were over. After the war, Grumman halted Hellcat production. The last aircraft rolled off the line in November 1945. Total production reached 12,275 aircraft, of which approximately 7,000 were the -5 variant. This production run made the Hellcat one of the most produced fighter aircraft of World War II, but more importantly, it made the Hellcat one of the most successful. 75% of all U.S. Navy aerial victories in the Pacific were credited to Hellcat pilots. 5,163 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air combat. A kill ratio of 19-1. These numbers reflected many factors: superior pilot training, better tactics, radar direction, numerical superiority, but they also reflected the aircraft itself. The Hellcat was simply a better fighter than what Japan could field in 1944 and 45. And the -5 with water injection was the best version of that already excellent aircraft. It took everything that made the Hellcat effective and made it more so: more power for combat climbs, more speed for interceptions, more capability for the pilots who flew it into the most dangerous skies of the war. The post-war fate of the Hellcat varied. Many were scrapped. The military no longer needed thousands of piston-engine fighters. Jets were the future. But some Hellcats remained in service for years. The -5N night fighter variant flew with the U.S. Navy until 1954. France purchased surplus Hellcats and used them in combat during the First Indochina War in the early 1950s. These French Hellcats, including -5 variants with water injection, flew ground attack missions against Viet Minh positions, demonstrating that the aircraft was still effective even a decade after its combat debut. For aviation historians and enthusiasts who came later, the Hellcat has often been overshadowed by flashier aircraft. The Corsair, with its distinctive inverted gull wing and higher top speed, the Mustang, with its long range and elegant lines. But the professionals who flew the Hellcat, who fought in it, who trusted their lives to it, knew better. The Hellcat was a war winner. It did not need to be the fastest or the most maneuverable. It needed to be effective, reliable, and available in large numbers. It achieved all three. And for those who understand the technical details, who look beyond the superficial attributes of maximum speed or ceiling, the water injection system in the F6F-5 represents something important. It represents the kind of incremental improvement that wins wars. Not revolutionary, not transformative, just better. Better in ways that mattered to the pilots who flew combat missions. better in ways that gave them advantages they could use, better in ways that brought them home alive. The mechanics who serviced these aircraft, men like Aviation Machinist's mate second-class John Henderson on the Essex, understood this. They might not have flown combat missions, they might not have engaged enemy fighters or intercepted kamikazes, but they knew that their work mattered. Every time they refilled a water methanol tank, every time they checked the ADI injection system, every time they ensured that an engine would deliver maximum power when a pilot needed it, they were contributing to victory. Their names are not in history books, their stories are not often told, but their work was essential. This is the larger truth about war. Victories are not won only by the men who fight. They are won by the men who build, who maintain, who supply, who design, who test. They are won by engineers at Pratt and Whitney who understood thermodynamics and detonation chemistry, by industrial workers at Grumman who assembled Hellcats with precision, by supply officers who ensured that water and methanol reached every carrier, by the mechanics who serviced engines under tropical sun and through Pacific squalls. All of this mattered. All of this contributed to the final result. The water injection system in the F6F Hellcat was not the reason America won the Pacific War. No single system could claim that distinction. But it was part of the reason. Part of the accumulated advantages that made American victory inevitable by 1944. Part of the technical superiority that gave American pilots the tools they needed to dominate the skies. Part of the industrial and engineering competence that allowed America to innovate, to improve, to optimize continuously throughout the war. For the Japanese pilots who faced these aircraft, the experience must have been profoundly demoralizing. They flew knowing they were outnumbered, knowing their fuel was poor quality, knowing their training was inadequate. And then they encountered American fighters that seemed to have unlimited power, that could climb and accelerate in ways that defied their understanding of aircraft performance. They had no way of knowing about the water injection system. They only knew that American fighters were faster, more powerful, more capable than anything they had faced before. Some Japanese pilots survived the war and later learned about the technical details that had given American aircraft such advantages. The water injection systems, the high-octane fuel, the sophisticated superchargers, the accumulated engineering knowledge that went into every system. For these veterans, the knowledge must have brought a strange mix of emotions: respect for the engineering achievement, frustration that their own nation could not match it, understanding, finally, of why the air war had been so one-sided. But in the moment, in the combat, there was no time for such reflection. There was only the immediate reality of combat. American fighters that were everywhere, that could not be caught, that destroyed Japanese aircraft with ruthless efficiency. And behind those American fighters was the entire industrial might of the United States, working at full capacity, producing better equipment, training more pilots, maintaining offensive pressure that Japan could never withstand. The F6F Hellcat, with its water injection system, stands as a symbol of this larger reality. An excellent aircraft made better through engineering and industrial capacity. A weapon system that gave American pilots tangible advantages in combat. A manifestation of the accumulated superiority that determined the outcome of the Pacific War. Not glamorous, not celebrated in the way that other weapon systems were celebrated, but effective, reliable, and ultimately victorious. In ready rooms on American carriers, in the decades after the war, aging pilots would sometimes gather and share stories. They would talk about the aircraft they flew, the missions they survived, the friends they lost, and inevitably, some would mention the Hellcat, the way it handled on carrier landings, the way it absorbed battle damage and kept flying, the way it gave them the performance they needed when they needed it most. And some would mention, almost as an afterthought, the water injection system. How that extra boost of power had saved their lives. How it had given them the climb rate to escape a bad situation. How it had allowed them to intercept that kamikaze before it reached the fleet. These stories, told in ready rooms and at reunions, preserved the human dimension of what might otherwise seem like dry, technical history. The water injection system was not just an engineering solution to a thermodynamic problem. It was a tool that men used to survive, to fight effectively, to protect their ships and their brothers. It was something they trusted, something they relied on, something that worked when everything else hung in the balance. And in the end, that is what mattered most. Not the theoretical performance numbers, not the engineering elegance, but the practical reality that the system worked, that it gave pilots what they needed, that it contributed to victory. The F6F-5 Hellcat with water injection did its job. It helped win the Pacific War. It brought pilots home alive, and it stands as one of many examples of how American industrial and engineering capacity, applied with focus and determination, could create weapons systems that were not just good, but exceptional at the specific tasks they were designed to accomplish. The purple liquid pumped into those Hellcat engines was just water and methanol. Simple compounds, readily available, nothing exotic. But when used correctly, at the right moment, they transformed good fighters into great fighters. They gave American naval aviation a crucial edge. And they contributed, in their small but meaningful way, to the final victory that ended the most destructive war in human history. That is the story of the water injection system in the F6F-5 Hellcat. Not the story of a revolutionary technology, but the story of incremental improvement, of engineering competence, of industrial capacity, all applied to the deadly serious business of winning a war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.